All right. Welcome in, everyone. We're getting kicked off here. Melinda's got us started. We got the recording in progress. Welcome in. Welcome in. It is a beautiful day today. Beautiful Wednesday. We're all going to let folks join in. As we can see, Melinda sends me a message. Turn off your Teams. Beautiful, beautiful day. So we do have Taj Adav, CEO of Lease on the call. Taj is someone that I've known for many years. We met at conferences, and his company does a lot of great work in and around really lots of different industries, but franchising is one that he touches a lot around leases and everything that has to do with that very complex industry. Taj, tell us a little bit about Leasecake before we get started with the call.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, thanks so much for inviting me. This is an auspicious moment. We've been friends for probably a number of years. I mean, even pre-COVID.
Yep.
I'm the founder of Lease Cake, founded the company about 7 years ago, a little over 7 years ago. And we're lease and location management made easy for the franchise industry, franchisors, franchisees, even corporate tenants as well. So we built a solution that helps operators that are trying to build their franchise empire. It could be their burger empire, their wax empire, their fitness empire, and they generally don't pay too much attention to that signed lease that typically sits in a drawer and no one looks at until it matters. So our platform helps really operators understand and have that lease information at their fingertips, because every great business starts with a location, and the more locations you have, typically the more leases. So we
Yep.
are lease management as well as what we call location management, keeping track of permits and licenses. And we've got now 40,000 locations on our platform.
Awesome.
Probably, yeah, probably 70% of our customers are PE backed. So we're delighted to be a part of the Fran Data ecosystem. And just, take it away, Paul.
Yeah, and one of the things I thought was really cool about trying to get you on in front of this group was that we talk so much about information for banks, and of course at Frame Data we do consulting and research for the brands, but the fact that this information is targeted for the borrowers and the folks that the lenders are actually lending to, I thought was really, really unique. So Taj is going to jump in with his perspective as we talk about the topic today. Um, Now, before we go on to that, again, as we were saying, we're going to be at the Mount Conference next week. Just kind of make sure everyone's aware. We're going to do a remote show from the conference. So that's going to be really, really exciting. And of course, the SBA lender rumor mill is still churning and continuing to grind forward. I thought to just update you on the latest of what we're hearing in terms of SBA. We do expect to see an SOP come out by the end of the month. That would be April. So expect a new SOP very, very soon. We do believe the the franchise directory is going to return. There is going to be some reversion to old processes and maybe some additional nuances. So this is more to say we know what's coming, but we don't know how it's actually going to be implemented. So really be staying tuned to our webinars, other webinars. Make sure you're on NAGLE calls, you're on SBA Connect calls. If you're going to be at these conferences, be attending those information sessions, because there's a lot of information that's going to come out about the process. Passive businesses are going to be looked at again in a different way. And in terms of engaging with franchise brands and with Fran Data, if you have franchisees, and this was one of the questions that came in today, we had two questions. And one was, what are other lenders doing to review franchise agreements and make sure that there are no conflicts? If you have franchisees or brands that were not on the previous SBA directory, or ones there where there might be some confusion, refer them to us and we can counsel them to set them up for the submission into SBA that is coming. There is going to be a streamlined sort of recertification, and I have that in air quotes because this terminology is not set. There's going to be a streamlined process for the brands that were already on the previous franchise directory to come back, get recertified, and then be listed. So there is some progress there. Make sure to be staying tuned to all the sources of information that you get for this stuff, because it is moving very quickly. Now, since our last call, obviously, we had a major black swan event in the implementation and rolling out of a major, major new tariff plan by President Trump in the US. across the world, and there's been a lot of reaction to that. But what I thought we could do on this call, so we had already really scheduled an analysis of coffee brands, and we're still going to look at performance. So we're going to look at the fund scores and reports. But I started to think, how could we start to understand the implications, knowing that it's a moving target, knowing that the numbers are going to change, the tariff rates are going to change as we grind forward. But how do we start to think about what the effects could be to a specific franchise brand or an industry or even a deal that we're doing? So how can we start to break down a franchise and what goes into it in through a tariff lens? So I thought about that in the context of coffee and wanted to look at certain inputs into a new build. So the first thing we did was we just looked at what are some of the common initial investments that we have when we start up a new unit. So I just want to look at a couple of items there and then sort of think about input costs and think about food and where they come from. And really what this boils down to is trying to understand where the different goods and inputs come from and where are they sourced in different elements of a build that are really, really important or have a high dollar amount, have a high cost in production. So the first category of investment I looked at were in leasehold improvements. So what are the types of things we do in leasehold improvements? We're using construction materials, we're using finishes, we're using different types of decor. Think about flooring, tile, and countertops. The current state is using things like quartz, materials like marble. And when I looked at that information, that was heavily imported from China, from Vietnam. We don't have a lot of domestic industries that import that type of material. So when we're thinking about those types of materials, we know they're coming from those countries, whatever those tariff rates end up being, and we know that those are in flux. When we're talking about leasehold improvements, we know that China and Vietnam, Southeast Asia are a lot of the supplies of that. One of the big themes in the research and sort of thinking about this was, well, what are the alternatives? Where are the alternatives to sourcing some of these things? And that's a second thing that you want to think about. So when you talk about, quartz and marble, well, what are the domestic materials? And in doing this research, a little bit of work and just a little bit of research, I was able to find, hey, there's a really robust domestic slate industry in the United States. And some of that is used in countertops and tiling and different things. Lighting and electrical fixtures, found that was almost 100% imported from China. So even if the lamps are assembled here, a lot of the parts and the bulbs and things come from China. It was 95% of the imports came from China. I will send this out after if you just want to see the information. There are a couple of links to where this data came from. But this data is readily available. The import data is on different government websites and things that people probably didn't pay too much attention to. Until now, but now that information is really relevant. So again, here's an example where, when we talk about lighting and electrical fixtures and signage and, there may be restrictions in your agreement, in your lease with a landlord or with a, certain shopping center that's going to dictate what you can and can't do. And I know that Taj, you have some, perspective on that. In your experience, are there restrictions like that that come in on the outside of a business in terms of the facade and what a franchise can do on the outside with its lighting?
Well, I would say in general, as lenders, I mean, I think the audience is made up of lenders and franchisors. Is that right?
Yep.
Um, in general, these costs that you're outlining, these high level kind of topics are covered in your tenant improvement allowances. And so you
Interesting.
definitely want to make certain that you have a reasonable TI allowance that your landlord and you certainly negotiate. But that's an area that as a lender, you may want to make certain that there's sufficient TI allowance that the landlord provides you. So that's one. And I think your question is, are there any restrictions kind of outside the building
Yep.
that from a risk perspective? I would say, if you've got a triple net lease and you're a standalone building, but right across is a strip plaza with other potential competing coffee brands, or you never know, there might be a smaller, let's say, concept that has a right to sell coffee.
Right.
You want to be certain that the lease that you're signing and that you're backing as a lender gives you an exclusivity provision around the ability to sell coffee. The last thing you'd want is to have some legacy brand, like you ever heard of Starbucks? So, legacy brands that have been around for a long time, and they
Right.
certainly have a lot of teeth. But at the same time, there are other smaller groups that I'll touch on later that you may not have even heard of that potentially 10, 12, 15 years ago that landlord gave them some type of exclusivity and some provision.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is really a great salient topic, Paul.
Interesting stuff. Totally. Now, I'm really interested because when we were talking before, and we were sort of kicking back ideas about how those lease provisions affect operations inside the box, inside the store. But outside obviously is something that's really important. HVAC equipment is one that isn't often at the front of mind when you're talking about a build out. They're frequently U.S. brands, but they do can contain a lot of imported components. Same story here, China, Vietnam, Southeast Asia. Now, decor and furnishing is more of sort of the inside of the building, the art, the signage, the plants, the different things that come inside. A lot of that can potentially be sourced locally. Think about local artists, local craftsmen, local mill workers and that kind of thing. So yeah, where it might have been easy to order a bunch of stuff, on the internet and have it delivered and bang it onto the walls, you might have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we build out the interior. Again, if franchise guidelines allow, and that's one of the things that's the backdrop of this entire thing, is that borrowers and franchisees and brands are going to have to get really nimble and efficient in this new environment and be able to make changes and adjustments on the fly. And those agreements that they've signed have to be flexible enough to manage that. So that's really, really important.
Yeah. And let's talk about one other piece that many people don't necessarily pay too much attention to. If you're spending any kind of money on HVAC equipment, it's obviously very expensive, but with the tariffs that are happening, that equipment is going to become even more expensive. Well, guess what? The warranty that comes with your piece of equipment
Mm,
is probably even more important to make sure if it comes with a 3-year warranty, for example, like a renewal notice or notification, right? You want to make certain that you renew your lease in time, the landlord doesn't give you trouble.
right.
Same thing can happen with a warranty. Wouldn't you rather be notified 35 months into your 36-month warranty to take a spin to make sure that you're doing that preventive maintenance, making sure that that manufacturer supports you? Because it's even more important to
Mm,
protect the asset that chances are you're the one as the operator that's obligated to provide HVAC equipment, right? It's
yeah,
probably in your lease. So all these things are
mm.
intertwined into what we call location management.
I didn't think about that. I don't want to go too much in the weeds, but with something like a warranty that's like a full replace or something like that, would that be affected by these downstream price changes, or is something like that locked in the beginning? To
You
your
know
knowledge.
what? It's all in the details, right?
Yep.
Date, dollars, and details.
Yep.
Whether it's a lease, whether it's an equipment contract, whether it's an equipment warranty, who knows what's in it. Generally, I think, the good news is that equipment manufacturers are pretty much a smaller pool than the wild, wild west of commercial real estate. But
Yep.
that smaller pool is, I don't know, like Lennox air conditioning. They probably have a standard bit of, a contract or certain types of things that are standardized. So to the extent that you've got a similar group of manufacturers that you use for HVAC as an example, you should hopefully get some consistency. But if there isn't consistency, that's when the things, Paul, that you just mentioned, like, oh, downstream, like, is it a full replace, or is it maintenance, or is there a warranty?
Yep.
It's again can be a little bit loose.
Wow. That's interesting. Interesting. So basic stuff in terms of operating the coffee operation. You're talking about coffee and espresso machines, blenders, refrigerators. With the espresso and coffee machines, the high-end stuff typically is coming from Europe. The mid-range or entry-level machines, brewers and grinders, that stuff is coming from some China, some Taiwan. So depending upon what's used in the location, may or may not have an effect. Of course, that's going to be a one-time fee in the beginning. So now we're talking about startup costs. Same thing with blenders, refrigerators, and ice machines. The high-end stuff is actually made in the US. Vitamix and Blendtec, they're manufactured domestically. Cheaper brands come from overseas. Pretty much what you're going to see across the board there. Furnitures and fixtures inside, a little bit different there. When we talk about service counters and cabinetry, Vietnam has a huge furniture industry. If you pay attention to that, it's exploded over the last 15 years. Turkey and India, other places. So again, thinking about this of where is the stuff coming from, and then what the impact winds up being, how do you interpret that? But then where are the additional strategies? Mexico actually has, I found in my research, pretty robust furniture manufacturing sector. So that's a potential alternative there. When you talk about ordering kiosks, menu boards, signage, screens, and that kind of thing, a lot of those electrical components are from China, sometimes South Korea. So that's again going to increase the upfront cost. And we're always talking with lenders about, what's in the FDD projection versus what it costs, and, build out projections that were here and they come out a little bit higher. This is just a little bit more sauce in that mix that we're going to have to pay attention to. And maybe some brands delay conversion or full conversion to kiosks and menu boards and just stick with static stuff for now. So that's yet to be seen, but I think those are some impacts that we can see coming. Again, this is for new locations and remodels and refreshes that might be happening across franchise systems.
Yeah. And also, as it relates to equipment, if the lenders here on the call are the ones that are financing it, in some cases, it's more advantageous for the operator to do a long-term lease. Those are the considerations that they need to have in place for what we call lease accounting, the new. It's 5 years old now. I keep
Yep.
calling it
Yep.
new, but ASC 842. So making sure that your real estate and your real estate leases are capitalized and amortized, but also the equipment.
Right.
Equipment is becoming more and more important, certainly in the coffee biz, because if you don't have a good espresso machine, good refrigeration, you don't you won't last very long.
Well, so there's the issue that we have to deal with, right? We're going to pay more for quality, or we pay less or the same, and potentially the end product suffers
Yeah.
as a result. And interesting, like if you're going to lease equipment, well, what if the everything about that lease is the same except for the cost is 50% more? It's going to change how that, turns out, and how maybe a business can support that. And what we'll see when we look at the fund reports here in a couple of minutes is that, profitability is already stressed in some systems and some franchise brands. So you may have some brands in some situations that, don't cash flow as well as they did, rest of this year into next year, as they maybe did last year, the year before.
Yeah.
Vehicles is a topic that's just more broad in franchising, and we're sort of starting to zoom away from coffee and then start to think about the larger franchise universe with this. Some coffee brands do mobile coffee trucks and carts and things like that. They're typically built on top of a domestic chassis, whether it's a truck or a van chassis, and a lot of that stuff comes out of the US market, Ford or GM vans. So if they're using that, it could be for point of sale business. Now, if we're using specialized vehicles, sometimes there's tuk-tuks and mini trucks. That stuff does come from India, China, Southeast Asia. More broadly, though, franchise systems are using trucks, vans, and vehicles as part of their core operations. And now if you're thinking about service brands and other types of franchises, well, now we're talking about larger vans and trucks and branded vehicles. Um, a lot of these are made domestically, but so much of what we've been talking about is the parts and the importing of parts and where the assembly happens and where the parts come. And then that, of course, will affect our downstream maintenance costs for these fleets that are part of franchise operations. So something to pay attention to, not as clearly defined as, a piece of furniture or a piece of equipment where we know where those suppliers are. The obviously the vehicle market and the auto market is much more complex supply chain. So a little bit tougher to sort of dig out and dig through yourself to understand, what the implication is of certain tariffs in certain regions on the vehicles. Then the food and beverage is, again, a super, super interesting one because there's so much complexity, and every, food brand does things differently. Coffee, obviously, we're almost entirely dependent on imported coffee. There's some grown in Hawaii, some grown in California. But we have a lot of coffee that comes from Brazil and Colombia and South America. I did find in this that Vietnam and Southeast Asia are actually very high producers of Robusta coffee, which is used in different instant coffees and blends and other different food products. So that's going to be affected. But a lot of the dairy and the dairy alternatives actually come from the US. So the US dairy supply is primarily domestic, if you didn't already know that, as well as almond milk. We're the top producer of the world in almond milk. And a lot of the oat milk comes from either domestic supplies or supplies from Canada. Same thing with soy. So it's interesting when you look at the breakdown of, the inputs into a certain type of business, how they'd be different. In doing this research, I also found that the chicken supply in the US is almost 100% domestic. So if you're thinking about, your Zaxby's or your other chicken brands and your Wingstop and all that kind of stuff, well, the core food item there is a domestic product. Whereas if I'm looking at, the avocados and berries and, sort of those off-season fruits and vegetables that might be in some other franchise brands, I'd be a little more concerned about that and what those impacts were going to be. And in terms of, where Taj comes at this from, a lot of the thought is, well, okay, we can pivot our menu, we can offer different things, we can maybe offer different types of food, but not so in your world, right, Tosh?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I wanted to bring up. So, of the coffee brands that you have on your fund scores, I mean, to what extent do they sell beans and coffee drinks? You mentioned the coffee bean part, and that's why I was asking this question because there are three types of provisions that are buried in a real estate lease that s- surprisingly kind of lock you down from a menu innovation perspective,
Hmm.
called the exclusive use provision, the prohibited uses or allowed uses. So I'll give you an example on the bean side. You might have a retailer that's just around the corner in that same plaza that's selling coffee beans. But if you're a brand new brand, let's say it's Scooters or Dutch Bros, and you're selling coffee drinks, like wow, let's sell coffee beans. To what extent is there a provision or a prohibited use in your real estate lease? So that's just tip of the iceberg, but I'll give you a sense of the high level numbers that we've seen.
Hmm.
Generally, from a prohibited use perspective, you could potentially be locked out and have a full restriction in about 10% of the cases that we've seen. You could be fully restricted and not being able to sell coffee. Now, I
At
know
all.
when you're in the coffee business, you do that research, but from a menu innovation perspective, you want to
Right.
think about it. But then there's things like partial restrictions, and partial restrictions get really, really hairy because in the case of, let's say there's somebody that's selling coffee beans, they've been around for a long time, it's right around the corner, and then you come in with this great coffee concept. Well, there might be a provision in there that says, you know what, you can't sell coffee beans at all. And it could be that, oh, maybe 10% of your sales could be coffee beans, or
Right. Right.
5%. It is an incredibly complex series of calcs. And the challenge is the onus is on you
Hmm.
to prove that you're not competing. So whether you're a coffee brand that wants to sell chicken sandwiches, completely extreme, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
like, is there anything that precludes you from selling chicken sandwiches? Or maybe, let's say, some a little closer, like cinnamon rolls. Is there anything
Right. Right.
precluding you from selling cinnamon rolls? So I think that's where something as important as that can unlock millions of dollars in revenue
Yeah.
could be locked down by a real estate lease.
Yeah, that is just that to me was like I had no idea that that was actually an element of lease,
Yeah.
but it makes
Yeah.
sense when you think about it. If you're going to make a commitment, a large commitment to a space, and you've been there, you'd want that kind of
Yeah.
exclusivity in the same way that franchisors will offer you a territory and exclusivity within that territory for their brand. It's sort of the same calculus. So I thought that was really interesting, and I'm not sure how much of our lenders and our SBA folks think to even ask that kind of question.
Yeah.
And I
And
think
that's
if
what we're
nothing
here.
else,
We're in the education business, Paul.
right,
Like, just like,
right.
let's inform and let's make sure that, lenders and operators and franchisors have, eyes wide open. The market's always evolving.
Yeah. Well, we actually wound up taking a lot of our time up with this conversation, which is, really, really interesting. But just to give us folks sense of where the performance is in the space, I had brought up a couple of the top franchise brands just to get a sense of them. And I'll just look at a couple of points. So, folks that don't know, we do scoring of franchise brands based on publicly available information. We call it a fund score and report. It's a lot like a FICO score for franchise performance. But the names that we were sort of kicking around on the call here were Scooters Coffee, Big B Coffee, Dutch Bros, which you can see here. And notice the differences around the country where these folks are located, right? So, I mean, I got Dutch Bros sort of, or Scooters in the center of the country and radiating out from there. Big B is a Michigan brand and now sort of populating and moving down the south of the country. And if you're a lender in the Southeast, you've probably seen a lot of Big B coffee. Dutch Bros started in the Northwest and is moving down California and into the central part of the US. And Beans and Brews is actually a smaller brand that is out of Utah. And I met their director of franchising at IFA. So they're coming up. And the new brand on the block that we've heard a lot about is a company called Seven Brew. And that is an emerging concept, but they are growing with large, experienced franchise operators. The one thing that we've seen across these, to just give us a takeaway, is that the unit economics is the one thing that has been stressed over time. Most of these brands saw a big bump in 2021 and 2022. It's hard to maintain 25 and 15% year over year growth every single year. Have sort of leveled out from that. But what we've been seeing is, even across our strongest brands, a depression in unit economics, that all these different factors are pressuring the bottom line profitability. So it's important to take a look at that. These tariff things, plan and issues are going to be affecting this as well. So you see that with Scooter's Coffee, you see that with Big B Coffee, another brand that's got pretty strong, um, average unit revenues and top line revenue, but unit economics, again, they're declining. Unit economics decrease of 13% over the last 3 years. And I'll give you one more example here. Beans and Brews is probably the strongest one of them in terms of the bottom line profitability, or their top line revenue numbers are a little bit lower. But their overall profitability, if you guys caught the margin, the number was around 150K was the bottom line. This one's around 220. But even then, I might even postulate that because the system is so new, these are the best locations, right? The newest locations, the one that are in the best locations, and they're naturally going to do better. And so over time, that's going to sort of decline. But um, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing really, really strong brands. It's a very hot space. But like other brands and across the economy, we're seeing some stress in the profitability and unit economics. And this is just going to be one part of it. So, um, thank you so much for coming on. I know that you were traveling this week and you took some extra time out of your day to sit down with us.
Well,
Um,
the timing worked out great because I was in the coffee mecca called Italy. I was in Milan, so it was perfect timing. And now I'm in London, but it's always a pleasure, Paul. You guys have a great operation.
Thank you so much. Great to see you, Taj, and everyone for joining us. We're going to be back again next week. Have a safe trip back to the US. Ping me when you get back here. And for the rest of the folks, we'll see you next week. We're going to be at the Mount Conference. We're going to grab some lenders. Hopefully, we don't have as crazy of a week as we did from last week to this week, but I'm sure there'll be some new topics and new events and things for us to go over. So we'll see you guys then. Thanks so much. See you,
Thanks,
Taj.
Paul. Thanks, Paul.